This podcast episode was originally recorded for Mormon Sex Info and is being refurbished for your enjoyment.
Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. This is Natasha Helfer, host of Mormon Sex Info. Welcome to the program. I am delighted to have Katie Langston with me today.
Hello.
I should say Dr. Katie Langston.
I'm not a doctor.
You've gotten your PhD, but maybe, okay, you've gotten your master's degree.
I'm almost done with my Master of Divinity. And so eventually I'll be a reverend, and you may refer to me as the Reverend Katie Langston.
Reverend Katie Langston.
But that's not yet. That's not yet.
I'm excited to talk about your educational journey because that's a big part of your story. But anyway, Katie is the author of Sealed, which just recently came out, An Unexpected Journey into the Heart of Grace. It's a story about her upbringing as a Mormon, child and then young woman and a young adult. And then her journey also as she leaves Mormonism into more of as she just mentioned, she is becoming ordained. And so is it the Lutheran faith that
Yep.
Well, why don't we just start there? Why don't we just start with letting you give yourself an introduction and a little bit about your backstory so that I don't keep botching it up.
Well, I always have wanted to be a doctor, so maybe someday that will happen. But so I'm Katie Langston. I grew up in Logan, Utah, in the Cache Valley area, and have a bachelor's degree in theater from Utah State University, married, have 2 kids, and am currently a student at Luther Seminary. I'm in my very last semester, pursuing a Master of Divinity. I am a pastoral intern in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, so that's been a 2-year kind of part-time pastoral internship where I'm in a congregation. I have a pastoral supervisor and sort of learning the rhythms of pastoral ministry. And then I'm also the director of digital strategy at Luther Seminary, where I work on projects that are about kind of cultivating vibrant Christian spirituality in a postmodern, post-Christian context and helping train pastoral leaders and other Christian leaders into what it means to minister in the 21st century. So that's,
Okay. Awesome. I think our paths first crossed years ago when, and I don't know that you're following this anymore, but you were in a marriage and family therapy program, I believe.
That's right.
With Divinity School as well, right? Like a pastoral counseling type of to couples therapy. Is that correct? Yeah.
So I started out. So when I came to seminary, I was still kind of a nominal Mormon, not thrilled necessarily to be a Mormon, but didn't know what else to be. And so I started in a dual master's degree program. There was marriage and family therapy with a Catholic university in the Twin Cities, and then a master's of theology at Luther. And I got about a year into that program and just wasn't quite feeling the therapy part. I was just like, this isn't quite right. And so I started in the theology program and then sort of realized, this is it. And so then eventually changed the degree to the Master of Divinity, which is the degree you pursue if you're a candidate for ordination. So it's sort of an ordination track degree. Yeah.
And so as part of that small year, you were part of the Mormon Mental Health Association.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And then you and I worked closely together also with the Protect LDS Children campaign.
Yes.
And you were one of the keynote speakers at one of the events.
Yes, along with you. Yeah, that was a memorable experience for me. So
for sure. Do you want to give just, I mean, it's interesting coming from the Mormon tradition where we really do not have theological degrees, you know, and we have a lay clergy within our faith tradition. Do you want to give kind of a quick overview of, you know, maybe a minute or two of just what that entails? And I think what piqued my curiosity too is what it means to minister in the 21st century. So is it social sciences? Is it theology? Is it what kinds of classes and training are you getting as a theologian?
Yeah, so we take classes in scripture, we take classes in pastoral care, we take classes in leadership, we take classes in theology, we take classes in preaching. We do a lot of contextual learning and supervised contextual learning. So there's a piece called clinical pastoral education, and that's when you go into a context, maybe a hospital. I was in a social services agency, and you work with folks and you're supervised. You know, you have a chance to reflect on when and how and why you showed up, you know, with a pastoral presence in a particular way that you did, and kind of analyze and deconstruct that with trained clinical supervisors. And then we do, like I said, as well, then you do an internship. Mine is 2-year part-time or 1-year full-time, again, where you're supervised and you're participating in the life of a congregation, participating in pastoral care conversations, preaching, you know, leading worship, that sort of thing, so that you can learn in a supervised environment, sort of how to become a pastoral presence and how to listen, how to care for people in ways that are helpful and not harmful.
And does that lean into any social science type of training as far as, since, you know, as far as when to help people? Because that's one of the criticisms that that's made at the Sam Young event, was that oftentimes people are showing up to their clergy with some really intense issues, you know, whether it's trauma, whether it's mental health. So how is that broached differently in your training? How are people in your congregation, for example, going to be equipped with a leader who's more able to give them the services or refer them to services that they need?
Yeah, so we do talk about the difference between like a pastoral advisor and like a counselor, and that they're not the same. And so like in some of my classes, we've had workshops from like sexual abuse organizations that have come in and been like, okay, like here's the laws, and like here's what you should do in the case of, you know, someone coming to you and they're in a particular situation or whatever. And yeah, it's clear that there is a difference between a pastoral presence, a pastoral caregiver, and then a professional mental health person, and that, you know, when we can come alongside people and have a sort of spiritual care relationship with them, but it's not clinical in any way, and we recognize that there are things that need to be referred to mental health professionals, sometimes the authorities, depending on the situation. And then we also do some fairly rigorous training in boundaries and stuff like that to make sure that we understand what healthy and appropriate boundaries are for caregivers.
The LDS Church recently moved to ministering language, right? That's a shift in language from, you know, visiting teaching, home teaching to ministering. What are your thoughts about that, given the context of how you're taught to think of that word and the maybe even training that goes into what's considered ministering per se?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good shift, you know, good for them. I think that that's a more helpful frame. And you certainly, you know, there's no sense in which a person has to have theological training in order to minister, in the sense that we can listen to one another, we can come alongside one another, we can be a supportive presence, we can pray with people, we can cry with people, we can mourn with people. There's no degree that's necessary to be a kind person and to be a person of faith, you know, who can sit with people in times of, you know, difficulty. So I think that's good. I'm glad that they did away with I understand anyway that they did away with like the reporting requirements and like, you know, making it sort of a mandatory checklist type thing. And so I'm all in favor of anything that they do to kind of move away from some of the more rigid aspects of the of the culture. I think that it is problematic. It can be problematic. A lack of training in theology and pastoral care can lead to like unintended negative outcomes, right? Where people aren't supported in healthy or helpful ways, where maybe they're shamed instead of, being told that they're forgiven. Maybe there's things that really shouldn't be handled. We've been talking about, there are things that shouldn't be handled by a pastoral caregiver that the person doesn't have the wherewithal to know that needs to be referred out or something like that. So I think training is awesome, but sort of at the community level, I'm happy that they made the switch from, say, teaching to ministering. That sounds good to me.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so in this memoir, this is kind of what you wrote, is a memoir about your experience growing up Mormon, and it was an interesting read for me because it really interplayed kind of a mental health journey of your own, spiritual health journey, and also a sexuality health journey. We're all very interwoven, and it had a lot of factors, which is, of course, why I talk to people about all the complicated factors of how we show up in our own Mormon stories. There was your family history, there was your mother and her, and father and how they parented you. So this parenting dynamic, and there were personality traits of yourself and also mental health considerations of yourself, because later in the book, you talk about how you come to find out that you're struggling with OCD, which is a compulsive disorder, which was, fairly clear to me in some of your initial chapters of the types of things that you were working about.
Right.
And I think this is where I think it's really important for Mormon listeners to hear and understand that the Mormon upbringing or environment, in any given ward or stake situation can have a variety of effects for different people, right? So one person who can say, it was a really healthy space for me. It was really supportive. Maybe, I was lacking some family structure at home, and to have, young men's or young women's leaders or primary leaders that would check in on me all the time, and carrying bishops, that was just astronomically supportive and wonderful for me. And I can't imagine the church being harmful for anybody, and then there's other people that may have very, very different perspectives. And one thing I've always kind of teased about whenever I do episodes on anxiety, anything that has to do with anxiety, is that high demand religions are usually not the healthiest of spaces for people who suffer with anxiety or OCD.
Right. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Like I have mild forms of anxiety, and I remember this really showing up for me in the whole end of the world, second coming rhetoric, having to have a 1-year supply rhetoric, and that I was getting very perfectionistic and kind of rigid in my own ways of feeling prepared, etc. So I definitely resonated with some of that coming from you. If you don't mind, I'm going to start off by reading a little bit.
Sure. Yeah.
One of your, actually chapter 1, which really interesting to me about how something very early on happened, which is part of normal sexual development, and really kind of, I think, created the foundation for a lot of what was happening for you, and also your relationship with your mother. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So you're 3 years old, maybe 4. So these are probably very early memories, right? I have some at that age, kind of broken up, fragmented. And you say, I ride around town for hours in this car seat while mom tows me along for daily errands. One afternoon, en route to one destination or another, I discover I can press myself down against the plastic latch between my legs and produce a pulsating sensation in my private parts. That was very well done.
You're welcome, everyone.
Masturbating against your car seat.
Exactly. That's what that is indeed.
Which, of course, is very common, especially for female bodies, up against the seat of the grocery cart. That can be
sure,
like a couch arm, or lots of up against a stuffed animal. It occurs to me that it's wrong. You're 3 or 4 years old, right? It's just a way to pass the time. My first clue comes months after my discovery in the second memory that is sharp as nails. So it's interesting how shame can be something that is very sharpened in our memory.
Mm-hmm.
We've stopped in front of Grandma Ackerman's house, and Mom unsnaps the buckle moments before I can make the feeling come. At first, I'm upset by the interruption, but then she says in a voice more urgent than anything I've heard before, "No, Katie, don't do that. That's something very special. It's not something we do in a car seat." That's it, over in 5 seconds. But not before I notice the fear in her voice, the panic in her eyes. The message I receive, though now that I am a mother myself, I am certain it is not the one she intends to send, is clear. You must never trust your body. More terrifying still, you can do something horribly wrong without even knowing it. So, and this begins kind of a pattern between you and your mother, because now your mother recognizes that you have this capacity for sexual pleasure, which makes her incredibly uncomfortable. And you start talking about a kind of almost a ritualized meetup almost daily, where she kind of talks to you about whether or not you are engaging with your body in this way.
Right.
So let's talk about that.
Okay, here we go.
What are your thoughts about this beginning journey in your life and how that starts to formulate this intersection between maybe something you were predisposed to, which was OCD, and also this environmental factor that caused a very shaming response from a very loving, well-intentioned parent?
Yeah. And I think it's, I can't know for sure, but my sense of my experience is that if that had not happened, I might not have developed OCD, which is why, when I talk about that story in the book where I say that I begged God to take me back there and to rewrite that exchange before it started, to be able to not, to change that happened. Because I think for a long time I was like, if only I hadn't either discovered it, or if only it had not been become a shameful thing, maybe I wouldn't have developed that mental illness. And there's no way to know that, right? There's no way to know. But it was sort of the primal fear that was the jumping off point for a lot of the anxiety that I experienced, that I've experienced throughout my life. And it's that sort of recurring, those two fears. What if, my body, I can't trust my body. And what if I did something without knowing it? Because that's what happened then, right? And the shame, I remember just growing up, the shame was just so overwhelming. So catastrophically overwhelming. I remember, and this was in the book a little bit too, but just thinking, especially when I was 7, about to turn 8, I can't turn 8 because I'm going to be on the hook for this. And, maybe I should die, I laugh. It's not funny, but should I live? I remember thinking I could never tell anyone about this. And I remember I was early on in my marriage, and I had never told anyone about it. And I told my husband, and I was physically shaking. I was shaking. And he just looks at me and he's like, so, he was just completely that's so normal. You don't need to be ashamed of that. It was sort of the first time.
Mormon husband that you're telling this to.
Yeah. He's a wonderful deal. But no one had ever told me that it wasn't a big deal. I'd always learned it was a really big deal. And so just sort of growing up with that sense that my own body was not trustworthy, or even worse, that it was bad.
And you do talk a lot about your 7-year-old self preparing for baptism, with the rhetoric, of course, that this is the one moment in life where your sins get cleansed away and you're clean. And that became a different type of fixation for you, right? That, oh my goodness, if that's the only time that can happen,
Yeah.
what does that mean? What are your thoughts about how that affects? Don't need really an OCD diagnosis to struggle with that one-time event where, like that pressure to remain clean after a baptism.
Yeah, I've heard other people say, like when I've shared that, I've heard other people say, oh my gosh, me too. I had those same thoughts. And some of them, like you say, like are not, say, clinically diagnosed, might not have a clinical diagnosis, but just that it comes down to the kind of theological framework that's operative in that, in this sort of construct. So the idea, first of all, that we have like a ledger of things, like that we have the things that we have to do, and if we do them wrong, then it's like getting marked down against us or something like that. That framework in and of itself, and then the need to be quote unquote clean, right? No unclean thing. Spirit of the Lord does not inhabit dirty temples. No unclean thing can enter the kingdom of heaven. Like this sort of rhetoric puts it within a theological frame that places all of this on our shoulders. Whereas, and so what the book is really doing is like pushing back against that a little bit, and well, no, a lot, and wanting to completely flip the script to say, actually, the one-time thing that is done is in Jesus' forgiveness. And that's the one-time thing that was done. And that's the thing that can never be taken from us. So that instead of, here's the one-time, clean slate, and now it's up to you all the time. It's like, no, God says, I have done this once and for all. And so you are free. And you don't have to worry like this so much. And I don't think there's any way to, if you take seriously the theology that says you have to clean the slate, I don't know how anyone doesn't drive themselves crazy with anxiety. I think those people aren't thinking it through.
Because there's plenty of daily opportunity, right? Where we struggle.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and even going back to kind of the masturbation story where this begins for you, I think that this is also much more common than people think, And I'd say even more so for maybe female bodies that grow up in these religious communities, because like you're saying, this happened to you when you were 3.
Yep.
I know from raising my own children that I observed rubbing up behaviors and hands down below the, diapers and all that.
Yep.
From very early ages, 6 months old, 1.5-year-old. And so when I ask people in my office, well, when do you remember if you have ever masturbated or touched your own body? And especially a lot of females who say they have never masturbated, they'll say, no, I don't ever remember doing that or having that kind of a drive. And yet my imagination is that even in those cases, there probably was something similar to this, where either a hand was slapped away or a no, don't do that, or hypervigilance, where from a very early age, as young as a year old, 2 years old, places where we don't really access memory, female body is getting the sense that this is not an area I should explore. Any thoughts of that as far as, I'm probably like just preaching to the choir when it comes to you, but as far as just your general idea about female sexuality in general?
Yeah, I think that like, especially, I think our entire culture, but I think especially say Mormon culture, it's just saturated in shame, right? And anxiety around our bodies, around women's bodies, and girls' bodies, female bodies. And it's taboo to imagine that a woman or a girl might want to explore their own body or have some sort of, semblance of sexual desire. I think the women are meant to kind of protect the men from their desire, as if the women don't have their own. And so I think that, trying to normalize, bodies and things. That's something I've tried to do with my kids. I don't know how successful I've necessarily been, because I'm still carrying the muscle memory of the baggage, even though I know better, there's still that kind of primal shame, that I think that still comes up, and I have to be really conscious about it. And I'm sure that with my own kids, I've, done things or made them, given them impressions that I didn't mean to give, but still just trying to be, open, honest, non-judgmental, pretty, accepting and encouraging of bodies. And yeah, aren't bodies great? They're beautiful. They're wonderful. They do cool things.
No, I love that you mentioned kind of that baggage that we all come from. And, I'm sure your mother had it too, right?
Oh,
so when
sure, yeah.
reaction from her and she's all worried and scared, I doubt that a lot of that is conscious for her.
Oh, for sure.
That is her own subconscious journey with whoever shamed her about sexuality. This is an intergenerational problem.
Exactly.
We have coming down the rails for millennia. But so I think that self-awareness, I oftentimes normalize it just because, like, I'm a sex therapist, for example. I've been super awkward with my own kids, or my own, reactions or overreactions to things, even though I kind of know better intellectually. That's because, your body memory, muscle memory that you talked about is shame-based, and why I think we all have some sexual healing work to do.
Yeah.
To that. I'd like to also kind of bring about, so I noticed obviously the very high lack of comprehensive sexual education that you received. I think you mentioned, right, that you were one of those kids that wasn't allowed to take a class, right? Yeah. Your parents, kind of in the spectrum of Mormonism, tended to be, I think, fairly orthodox in their approach.
They were on the conservative end of a conservative religion. That's sort of how I think of it, yeah.
Right. And in chapter 7, so here's the first time that, you start talking about, like, pre-puberty, maybe puberty age, friends start talking about sex. You had a friend who said, well, that, you have the garage and has the car. I remember those. We had trains and tunnels. we had all these metaphors to talk about these really enticing, scary things we were talking about, right? Your mom. So you asked your mom about this, and she says, well, she cleared her throat and shifted her weight. And she says, you don't have a garage, Katie. And I thought, well, that's actually, fairly good. That was a good start. But she says, you get pregnant by loving a boy in a very special way. Oh, I said. This made much more sense than Sandy's convoluted explanation, though now I felt apprehensive. No wonder there are so many teenage pregnancies, I thought, recalling the whispered conversations I'd overheard among clusters of concerned mothers. All you have to do is love a boy. I made a vow right then to never let it happen to me. So let's talk a little bit about how when parents don't really talk to their kids, when kids don't really have information, what happens? What did happen to you?
Well, can I swear on your podcast? You just make shit up.
On my podcast, I do not monitor my people's language.
You just make shit up, right? So it's like, it was like, okay, so I really did think, I was like, if you fall in love, that makes you pregnant. And so therefore, I must never fall in love.
What do you think that does to the psyche of a developmental teenager, right? I mean, I'm guessing you're 12 at the time, somewhere around there. You're probably having your first crushes. You're probably noticing that, whether you like boys or girls or whatever it is that you're liking, you're probably noticing some of that, right? So now you're in a position where you are artificially trying to halt yourself from having certain types of feelings, I imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would think so. There was just sort of like a holding back. I'm not going to let myself invest emotionally in some of these ways. And I don't, to be fair to my mother, eventually she told me, at least the bare basics, right? So I don't know how long that lasts. Not like I'm like 14 and 15, thinking that if I have a crush, I'm going to get pregnant. But yeah, I mean, I do think back on that and wonder, because there were a lot of times in my adolescence in particular where I was really scared of boys. I didn't even more than, I mean, what adolescent girl knows how to talk to boys, right? But there was just, let's put it, I'm the oldest of 5 kids. There are 5 kids in my family, and I have 3 younger sisters. And they were all boy crazy in a way that I remember them being about that same age and being like so interested in, the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, that I'm dating them and myself or whatever. And I remember just like not wanting to go there or to feel that way at that age, like that I wasn't, that was a scary thing that might get me into big trouble. So I don't know like what long-term impact that had, but it certainly had an impact for sure.
Right. And as you start dating and having some, with kissing and I think there was an excerpt in the book where you talk about the first time a boy even tried to touch a part of your body and how you recoiled away from that.
Yep.
Even though there was pleasure in it for you as well,
sure.
there was reaction.
Right.
So you're from a very early age, you're pitted against your own body, your own desire. You're not necessarily making decisions out of your own desire or pleasure, making decisions about whether or not you're clean or not. Is that
right?
Fair?
Yeah. Well, and I would even say making decisions against my own pleasure or desire, right? So it's like, it's not even like, am I clean? It's more like, if I feel this way, that feeling in and of itself needs to be shut down, that's bad, that even the experience of the feeling of desire is wrong.
Yeah.
So that's sad.
That set you up just in general as an adult female married woman?
So a couple of things happened that were a great gift as well, though. And one was that I was a theater major in college. And as silly as it sounds, like there was, even though I would not say like I had an experience of sexual liberation in a conventional sense, there is something about being around other people all the time, changing clothes backstage, and then just like learning to let go of like bodily inhibitions. That was really helpful. And so, I think I talked about this in the book too, but like, I was in Cabaret, the musical Cabaret, and I sang the song Two Ladies, which is a pretty naughty song, and, and played parts, played roles, embodied roles of people who were really different from me, who had really different experiences and morals, and, were sexual people. And so the chance, I think, to kind of expand my horizons artistically in my imagination. And then the thing about theater is that it's a physically embodied art form where you're actually entering into another life, another person. There was something about that was quite freeing, as far as comparatively speaking, I guess you could say. I'm sure to everyone, like the most of the world, I still was pretty repressed. But for like a Mormon girl from Logan, I was edgy. And so my best friends and I, even my Mormon best friends, we would talk about sex all the time, mostly about like how interesting it would be when we finally got to do it. But we were very, we were pretty open about it. My friends who got married before I did, they were like, listen, here's the 411. Like, they would tell me all the things I needed to know. And so by the time I got married, I was sort of split, right? I had sort of a dual sense of myself. On the one hand, I wasn't ashamed of my body or afraid of my husband, right? Like, and my husband, again, is just the loveliest, most wonderful man. And yet, leading up to the wedding, I was terrified would do something wrong that would make it so that when we were married, I couldn't feel worthy. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's terrified to enjoy really any of the kind of erotic energy that you and your husband while you were dating.
Right.
More than likely experiencing. I mean, I hope you had sexual attraction for him, right? That's
right.
This is an issue that I see too, is that people are so terrified of that same thing that they'll actually couple with people where there is no or little sexual chemistry, because it's easier to manage that terrifying feeling and not be in danger. And then they'll marry like a good friend, right? Instead of like a sexual chemistry type partner.
That's really interesting. Fortunately, that was not my situation, but I can see how that would happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So what did that mean for your dating experience? Do you think, looking back now, did you kind of get over that okay, or did it cause some issues? And
I mean, dating was a minefield, and my anxiety, especially. So before my mission, so I went on a mission, right? And so my dating pre-mission was a lot more free. Not that anything exciting happened, because it most certainly did not.
I think all these spectrum kind of code language that we talk about.
Yeah, but it was, it was within the bounds of the rules, but let's just say like right up to the line, kind of thing. But then my mission and going to the temple and going on my mission caused my OCD to get way worse, like extremely bad.
Which is not common, by the way. I just want to say that is not uncommon, because you're, again, taking people to a more structured and more rigid environment.
Right.
Flexibility.
Yes, that was my experience. So I was extremely anxious on my mission, and I was extremely anxious when I came home as well, and especially around sexuality, like especially terrified to do something wrong. Because what had happened on my mission was like all of the times that I had, let's say, it had not, when I was saying like if you go up to the line or whatever, those became a torment to me. And I'm like, well, did I cross the line? And so I found myself confessing. I confessed in the MTC, and the MTC president was like, you're fine. And I confessed to the mission president multiple times, things that didn't happen or that weren't a big deal if they had or whatever, just to be safe. And then so when I got home, it was like I don't want to have to confess. I don't want to have to do anything that's going to like trigger this anxiety response. So then of course I'm like hyper vigilant about absolutely everything. And so I'm feeling even more anxious as a result of that, and that was not fun.
Yeah. Were you terrified of doing something wrong, or were you also terrified about sex itself? And because there's a difference.
I was terrified of doing something wrong. Yeah, I think that's the distinction I was trying to make. Like I wasn't afraid of sex once we were married, but I was terrified to be unworthy and to do something that would make me unworthy. And I was terrified to have to confess, because I'd had such horrible experiences in bishops' interviews and stuff like that, that I just did not want to have to talk about it with some rando, right? Some dude.
Yeah. So let's back up, because I think that this, the first interview that you process in the book is your baptismal interview, which is usually about the first time Mormon kids start getting that experience of going in and talking to an adult authority about pretty important things, and it feels like a pretty important process. And I'm sure for most kids, that's a fairly intimidating process, even if it's a positive person who's involved, right? I want to be clear that I don't think that we're trying to paint the picture that Mormon bishops are necessarily these evil, bad people.
No.
The process in of itself is there's a power dynamic there.
It's harmful.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about what were some of the experiences? I think that it's also very common for people with OCD or anxiety to be kind of what I call serial confessors.
Oh, that was me. Yeah.
And they're like, oh my goodness, have I done something wrong? Many times for things that other kids or other grownups wouldn't consider that serious.
Yep.
But you're kind of highly scrutinous of yourself. This is another word is used, scrupulosity, right?
Yep.
So, yeah, let's talk a little bit about what your experiences were. When did it go well? When did it not? What kinds of questions were asked, etc.
Yeah. I mean, I would say it never went well, because I think the entire construct is completely absurd and harmful and frankly abusive. So that's how I feel about bishops' interviews in general. I think they're terrible, and no one should ever do them with anyone at any age. And that doesn't mean that you can't have a pastoral relationship with someone as pastor, but to frame it in this thing where it's like, I'm a judge, right? I'm a judge in Israel, and here's my checklist of things that you have to live up to in order to be like deemed worthy in the eyes of God. And I'm going to listen. And if, and I'm going to decide how you stack up. That entire framework, that entire construct is just absolute nonsense. It's nonsense.
It's very like we said, intimidating. There's a power differential. And quite frankly, that even I agree that the process in of itself is harmful. And then to add to that, you get a lot of variety about how that is even forward with, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's a theological, pastoral, like emotional, psychological disaster, and it needs to like be done away with yesterday. Having said that, I had some experiences, so they were all bad. To answer your question, they were all bad because the construct itself is wrong. But there were some that were worse than others, like I had one bishop, and in the book, I kind of, I had a couple, I couldn't go through every single time that I had a bad experience. So some of them I combined, different experiences into one, but, bishops asking, I had one bishop kind of pull out the, for the Strength of Youth pamphlet and ask me like every single question for the Strength of Youth pamphlet. I had, including questions about like masturbation, I had one that's like, did I swear? And I like, sometimes I'm like, sometimes maybe I swear. And he was, that was really bad. Just like all kinds of stuff. When I was older, I was asked questions like, did I experience sexual climax at certain times? Just like all kinds of like just really inappropriate things that, were just not appropriate.
I would like to take actually one of the least problematic examples out of your book, just to show that how it's pretty problematic already.
Yeah.
So this is, sometime during your teenage years. And so you're going in, he says the Lord specifically forbids certain behaviors, including all sexual relations before marriage, petting, sex perversion, masturbation, or preoccupation with sex in thought, speech, or action. How are you doing with the stuff on this list? I do think it's important to think about this, right? Whether you're not of our faith and are like, wait a minute, this seems really weird. What is going on? But especially if you are of the faith where this has been normalized, this behavior has been normalized.
Yes.
To have a 12 or 13-year-old girl in a room with an older man who just said the word sex perversion in of itself causes anxiety and imagery and thoughts that you have no control over in this environment. This young woman is by herself with no boundaries being taught and, and kind of open-ended questioning. So you say, well, I flushed, my voice broke, and I stammered honestly, because again, like a lot of kids just say, no problem, I'm out of here, right? That's how a lot of kids deal with this, but not a kid with anxiety, not a kid with OCD. In fact, you probably are hyper vigilant, like any little
Absolutely. Yep.
So you're like, well, there's a couple of things in there that maybe I don't know I've done before. I could feel the tension in the room rising. Oh, oh, he said, like what? Well, I mean, sometimes I think things, maybe not the best thoughts. And so he normalizes that a little bit, right? He's like, well, sure, we all have thoughts like that from time to time. But again, like the whole process is about probing now. Now it's his responsibility.
Right, exactly.
If it's really an issue or not. Well, how are you going to find out if it's an issue or not? You have to ask probing questions. So he's like, how often do you think these kinds of thoughts? Daily, hourly, all the time? You say maybe a few times a day. Well, do you do something about them, right? So the ongoing, so now, you think about this young woman or young man in this room kind of nervous, squirming, again, kind of hustling for their worth, trying to see if they're going to pass a test of worthiness, which in of itself is the construct that we're concerned about.
Yep.
And so, you're like, I froze. I knew exactly what he meant, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words. So he asks again, well, have they? Mm-hmm. And then you forced yourself to whisper, sometimes I guess, and then he says, touch yourself? Mm-hmm. He asks and you nodded. And he says, well, it's good that you told me. And you say, I don't mean to, it's just a bad habit. I think he knows I'm trying, Heavenly Father, right? So this is very benign compared to what many, many people have reported being asked in these worthiness interview questions. Because again, if you have to probe, you're probing, well, do you touch yourself over your underwear or under your underwear?
Right.
Touch yourself when thinking about a certain person or not? And of course, if there's any type of, same-sex attraction or anything like that, now they're probing about that. And it just becomes this extremely intrusive, inappropriate, unboundaried way to treat our minors. So, what's your reaction as I read your own words and experience back to you?
I kind of I'm transported there again, like I'm remembering how that felt in my stomach and how that felt in my body and how ashamed and embarrassed and mortified, right, I was of that experience. It's just, there's just nothing appropriate about it. And the thing that's funny, Natasha, is you just said, to us, that sounds not relatively tame. Let me tell you, telling that story to people who are outside of Mormonism freaks them the hell out. They're like, they did what? They asked you what? They said what? So we need to understand, it is not a normal thing. It is not. It's a thing that makes outsiders think we're crazy, and we probably are. I mean, you know what I mean? That it is not appropriate.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit? I mean, a lot of times I think, and I remember even having this thought the first time I challenged the thought of worthiness interviews. You know what my first thought was? Well, but then how are we going to hold people accountable, or how are we going to make sure that our kids are protected from, really risky behavior? Or it's almost like you can't allow yourself to think that there might be a different way, because what I don't want the message to be is that somehow the choices are either worthiness interviews or the world is a free place, kids. Just go do whatever the heck you want, right? And it seems sometimes like we get caught in that weird binary. That's not what this is about. So how do other congregations deal with issues about sexual health and sexual responsibility and values and morals when it comes to ethical responsibility, which I think we all care about? I think most parents care about those themes when it comes to dealing with the sexuality of their own kids, which is one of the most uncomfortable things to deal with as a parent.
I know, seriously. Oh my gosh. Yeah, so I think it really does depend on the tradition, and there are certainly Christian traditions that do a very bad job of it. And then there, with purity culture and purity rings, and they're out there, as it were. And then there's and purity vows and all that kind of stuff. That's all pretty bad stuff. And then there, I think I'm more in a scenario where, to be honest, maybe we don't talk about it that much, we leave it up to the parents to talk about it since it is so fraught.
A bad thing.
No, yeah. I mean, I think that at its best, there's like curricula created by like the UU's, Unitarian Universalists, and the UCC, United Church of Christ, have jointly created a curriculum called, I think it's called Our Whole Lives. And it's a sex positive sort of responsibility based, kind of comprehensive sex education program within a framework of holistic kind of spirituality and thriving and that kind of thing. The way I think that it's appropriate to talk about is to talk about consent, talk about boundaries, and then within a Christian context, to talk about covenant, right? That an expression of commitment is probably the better word. And my denomination has a document about sexual ethics I really actually quite like. It's not shaming. It's, doesn't turn it into a catastrophe or the sin next to murder, but at the same time, talks about the appropriateness of sex within marriage and, it's long-term relationships, that kind of thing. I think there are certainly ways of talking about sexuality in a faith-based context that don't catastrophize, even if you're committed to a more, say, traditional sexual ethic of like sex within marriage or something like that. We can do that without catastrophizing it. I don't know why it has to become, even if you think, let's say, sex outside of marriage is a sin, even if that's what you think, why does it have to be, why is it like a bigger sin than other sins, right? Like that doesn't make any sense to me.
Right. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, because I think that that's the goal here. It's not to change people's values or beliefs necessarily about their morals in regards to sexuality, which are very personal, and of course, from our faith communities and our traditions. It's about how do we have those values and offer education and spaces where people, especially our children, can thrive and either, if they're going to quote unquote make mistakes or explore or adopt different values than we may have as parents or as church communities, how do we still remain inclusive? How do we prioritize principles of safety and responsibility versus, certain arbitrary conditions?
Right.
And just something as simple as, well, don't masturbate and only have marital sex.
Right.
Even if people do that, even if they follow those two dictates per se, does not at all correlate to good sexual intimacy within a marriage.
Right. Exactly.
Principles of pleasure, right. Principles of consent, principles of understanding your own body and another person's body, right. Principles of compromise and negotiation, because nobody shows up in the same sexual space, the same way.
Exactly.
So you're not protecting your children from much of anything other than maybe, I guess some STIs or unwanted pregnancy. And even then you're not really protecting them because you think you are, but
people are people, like the people are human.
Yeah.
And so like trying to
make bigger mistakes.
Right. And like, creating such a culture of shame around it only causes things to go out sideways, right? It only causes things to then be done in secret, to then be done in a compulsively, right? In a context of self-loathing. And so that it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
In addition to being theologically, psychologically, pastorally, emotionally, whatever, harmful, it's just plain not effective at the end of the day.
Right. Well, so given all of that, I know that I'm way over time because it's so kind of fun to talk to you about this topic. But obviously the book ends with your journey away from Mormonism, and I do want to give you a chance to talk about that. At the same time, I want to be clear that I'm supportive of all journeys, whether people stay in Mormonism, move to religion and or become non-religious in their own spaces. So I think that we have things to learn from every journey as far as things that we can be privy to, empathic to, and also bring back to our own traditions. Like, okay, if this person who grew up in our tradition, for example, found these things not helpful to the point that it was no longer viable for them to stay in our community, maybe there's something there that we can learn from them, right? For them to do want to stay, etc. So anyway, why don't we finish up with kind of how your journey has morphed into leaving Mormonism? How has that been healthy or sad for you? And what would your kind of closing thoughts be about what this all means?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think having grown up with all of that shame and anxiety and very much in a kind of tit for tat kind of worldview where it's like, you got to do this checklist of things in order to reach this level of acceptability called worthiness, in order to have the Holy Spirit with you, in order to enter the temple and receive the blessings of exaltation, et cetera, et cetera. That reached a point in my life where it just simply was not tenable, where my anxiety was just out of control and my shame was debilitating. And in the midst of all of that, I had an experience with the grace of God. I had an experience that I felt deeply in the depths of myself that I didn't have to earn worthiness, that I was not at risk of being excluded from my family forever, that I wasn't at risk of being cast away from God, that God was going to abandon me if I was imperfect or unworthy. But instead that God was claiming me, pursuing me, loving me, holding me exactly as I was, and that I didn't have to worry about losing that at any point because it just simply isn't losable. And that really changed things for me. That really turned things around for me and revolutionized my life in really profound ways. And one of the most important, the way I think about it, is that it opened up space to then do the long, hard work of healing. Whereas before, I couldn't even imagine a world in which it would be okay to let go of some of this anxiety because that anxiety kept me safe. When I knew I was safe, no matter what, then that gave me space to work with it. And so the book doesn't go into a lot about therapy or some of those things. It is a spiritual memoir. It talk about that I, went to therapy. Take anti-anxiety medications every day, learned how to manage my OCD through medication, both, and therapy and that kind of thing. But also just had to relearn what is it like to live in a world with that kind of freedom. What is it like to occupy my life knowing that I'm freed in Christ to be whole, to make mistakes, right? And to serve others. And so the book is really a journey about not just coming to that conclusion or coming to that, having that experience and coming to understand how transformative grace was, but then also where did that lead me? How did that change the trajectory of my life? And part of that has to do with call to ministry, but most of it has to do with what does it mean to live fully into the freedom that grace supplies. And eventually, that did lead me out of Mormonism. I can imagine a scenario that wouldn't have. I think that you have to be able to ignore some of the institutional stuff, but you can do, you could have a grace-based perspective and approach within Mormonism. I think it's an uphill battle as long as they're doing worthiness interviews and tying that to your salvation. You don't have a grace-based construct, but you can ignore that part and plug along. And I know people who do, and God bless them, and they're doing important work and what have you. But for me, my journey took me away in part because I felt a call to ministry, and in part because at the end of the day, I just could never reconcile it.
Yeah. Well, and I do think that that's something that, your tradition of your historical tradition, and I guess I still call it my tradition, although, this has been part of my journey too, is, you don't get to belong, right? If you don't if you don't prove your worth in certain ways. But I do think that's something for Mormonism to wrestle with, is this dichotomy between progression, which I think we all value, and growth, which I think we all value, and being able to sit with the worth of individuals as they show up currently. You know, that worth just is. It is not something to be hustled after. And so that's yeah, I think I see that as a tension that is, quite frankly, driving a lot of the dissatisfaction currently within our community, and why a lot of people end up not finding it a viable space to stay or raise their children in, because they don't want their children to have those kinds of same, you know, issues that they felt very strongly growing up themselves. So well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope that you'll all pick up a book and support Katie, because it's great. It's called Sealed, An Unexpected Journey into the Heart of Grace. Anything else that you want to either promote or talk about, or where people can find you? Or
yeah, sure. You can find it. You can find the book on Amazon or on any IndieBound, bookshop.org. It's an Audible as well as an audiobook. So find it wherever fine books are sold. And you can find me on my website, katielangston.com, or the publisher's website is thornbushpress.com.
Okay, perfect. Well, Katie, I hope that our paths cross soon again, because I've always enjoyed my time with you.
Same, Natasha. Thank you so much.
Hope to see you soon, and that all goes well for you. Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show. Chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous waves, obey thy will. When thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not,